Hi, I'm Mark. I'm the Programme Leader of the Education Studies course at Warwick. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about Education Studies as a degree programme and a bit about the degree at Warwick as well. Okay, so in this video, what am I talking about? I'm going to outline what Education Studies is to start with. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the sorts of things we do on our course, what are the questions, a couple of the topic areas, and then a little bit more about the degree programme sort of woven in as we go. So first of all, thinking about what is education as a degree subject. Well, the first thing to say is that it's not really just one thing, really. Education is a really multidisciplinary area, so it includes lots of different disciplines, lots of different ways of thinking about the question of education. So it's really varied and it's really dynamic as a subject area. So you'll be encouraged to wear different hats, hence my picture, as a student of education. So we come at this question of education through many different lenses. So through sociological lenses, through psychological lenses, through philosophical, through political, and also through sort of practical and applied angles as well. So we think about, what will these things look like in the classroom, but that's not just our only focus. So we're not just thinking about teaching and learning in schools. Education studies typically encourages as wide a view as possible of education. We use a wide range of lenses, all of those different lenses, different disciplinary perspectives to ask critical questions, important questions, big questions about the role and the purpose of education. And it's tempting to think about education as really just about the skills and the qualifications we need to get a job or to get to the next level of study, because that's often how it's framed and how it's talked about. But what we try to do is make these wider connections between education and society. So in particular, the role of education in some of these biggest issues facing local and global communities today. So 3 pictures that sort of expresses that really. So in the middle is a picture of the climate emergency school strikes from a couple of years ago. On the right is a picture from a Black Lives Matters protest. So we need to ask questions about the role of education in these sorts of issues. What role does education play in averting a global climate crisis? What does education for anti-racism look like, for example? And that raises questions about the purposes of schooling. What are schools of education, and what are schools for, and what should be prioritised in their curricula? And gets at this question of the balance that education has to strike between maintaining the status quo and passing on knowledge and culture from generation to generation, and on the other hand, seeking to challenge and transform society. The other picture there on the left, of course, represents the coronavirus pandemic. So we could think about things like public health education. For example, how does the public become educated about personal and community health? There's one question, it's an education question. But there's also about schools and other educational institutions, how they approach perhaps quite radical changes that had to be put in place when we can't teach in close proximity. Your experiences will attest to that exactly. So that raises questions around, is online teaching different to face-to-face teaching, and in what ways? But we're also thinking about other questions with that. So what about learners' sense of belonging that's linked with a physical place, going to school? So we're thinking about questions of identity and community and inclusion there when we're thinking about education. Those are really important big questions too. So really, I suppose the point I'm making is that studying and understanding education is hugely important in getting to grips with the present and the future challenges we face, both individually and as a society. So I'm not going to spend too much time at all on this page, but I just wanted to sort of indicate what the first years on our course take to give you a sense of sort of things that you might study when you are on an education studies course, if you were to want to come to join an education studies course. Here's a handful of them. So you can pause the video and just have a look at the names, or you can go on the website and find a little bit more about the things we offer in the first year. But it is useful to just add on top of that a few of my virtual post-it notes to kind of summarize really how we come at education, the study of education in our first year. So I've already mentioned some of these different discipline areas. So the philosophy of education, the sociology of education, psychology of learning. We get that creativity in there as well. But we also cover things like child development and learning too. We have a global perspective as part of our degree program also. And one important thing that we do in our first year is we have a module specifically designed to help students transition to university. We have people from lots of different backgrounds who study lots of different things before they come to us. So we want to help them develop their skills to make sure they're as sort of effective a university learner as they possibly can be. So that's an important part of our first year for every student. And this is quite a neat way of summarising really what we do in our first year really. And we ask big questions. So we ask questions like, how do we learn and what is the purpose of education? We think about how schooling compares internationally. We ask, what does it mean to be creative? We think about what's important in early childhood as a sort of starting point for a lifelong journey of learning. And then that transitions module that I was just talking about, we ask questions and we prompt you to think about how you study best and how you can get yourself in the right situation to be able to study best when you're on your degree. So we ask you big questions and we give you some ways of answering those big questions as well when you're on our degree. So what I wanted to do in the next bit is to pick up on a couple of those big questions. So the first one is, how do we learn? And this comes from one of our first year modules called Theories of Learning. So we ask, how do we learn? So understanding learning. Okay, so where do we start with that? There's so much has been said, so much has been written, so much research has been done about how we learn. So it's a really rich and interesting module to study actually. Some starting points for that are these are sort of ideas here. So first of all, when we're thinking about learning, we're thinking about change. We change with age, we change with context, we change with situation. But it's also about how we stay the same. What parts of us, of our development, of our journey, in which ways do we stay the same throughout that? And that's equally as interesting as the question about what changes. We think about, and when we think about studying and learning, we think about a whole range of different areas. So focused in the field of human development, we're thinking about these kind of behavioral, thought, cognitive, emotional and personality changes that evolve over time. So that's kind of a focus of our study in understanding learning. But we also extend that beyond just sort of the typical thinking of childhood development stages. We think about how adults will evolve as well, adapt, extend their ability to engage with the world, and that's picks up on this final point about lifespan development. And lifespan development asks not only about the way that we cognitively or physically change, but it's also trying to connect that in with the cultural, historical, political context in which that development takes place. And that's a really important point, and you'll kind of get that theme a little bit throughout all of what I'm going to say in this kind of video, because that connection between us as individuals and us in our social context is vitally important nugget to take away from this video about what studying education is all about. So some sample definitions. There's lots of different definitions of learning, and Pritchard here helpfully gives us an insight into some of them. So key really is this idea of change again, and gaining something, gaining knowledge or gaining a skill. And the other key feature of this idea of understanding and defining learning is about it's a process. It's a process of gaining, of changing, that's based in experience. So our range of experiences we have prompt a process of gaining skills and knowledge, which changes us, changes our behavior, changes our potential to do things. So just to summarize those ideas quickly before we move on to a related question. How does human learning occur? So first of all, it occurs through experience, through watching other people do that, through observing that happening, something happening, but also through our own practice, our own doing of something. We learn through doing something. It involves change. So it's a process through which we become more familiar with something to becoming more expert at it. It endures over time, but not necessarily forever, and that's interesting. So to be called learning properly, it needs to stick for a certain period of time, but we all know that we don't necessarily learn things, and things don't stick, and we aren't able to do things forever. You know, that kind of falls out of our mind somehow, and that process is an interesting one. How do we learn losing, and how can we make it stick better? And all of these points and all of these kind of questions that these points throw up are really important for us as educators. You know, if you want to go into education in some form or another after your degree, these questions are important questions, but they're also important for when you're studying as well. How is it that you're going to learn better whilst you are a student yourself? So these questions relate to this other idea of kind of transitioning to university and becoming a more effective learner whilst you're at university. So these questions are important for that as well. So the next question I'm going to ask you and talk a little bit about is this one here. What is the purpose of education? And this relates really neatly to the first question about how do we learn? So we can study and understand the process, the cognitive process of how we learn, how we become more proficient at something. But the question we haven't asked is, what's the purpose of that learning? Well, what is underpinning the reason for us learning that thing? So the question of what is the purpose of education is a really important second to how do we learn something in the first place. You know, the question of why do we learn is a big one related to what's the purpose of education. So this comes from the module Education Today that I happen to teach. So well, how do we answer that question? Where do we start? Well, I'm going to start with Biesta, who is a modern day educational philosopher, and he's writing about the functions of education. So he says there are three interrelated, overlapping, intertwined functions of education. They are qualification, socialization, and subjectification. So first of all, qualification. So that's the the getting a certificate. That's the bit that, the education which trains us in a particular skill, or it makes sure that we've got the right amount of knowledge to be able to pass that test, to be able to get that certificate, which then convinces the employer that we have got the skills they need for the job they're advertising, or the university or the college to take us on to their course because we've convinced them that we've, the certificate says we've studied at a high enough level, got a good enough grade to go on to that next step. So it's a really important part. It's an undeniable function of education that we use it to get qualification, to go and do the thing we want to do and that society needs us to do. So it's an important role for education. The second one, socialization, that is about sort of passing on of values, passing on of social, cultural, political values from one generation to the next, which serves the function of maintaining, preserving society, preserving some of the sort of the cornerstones of society. The third one is subjectification. So in a way, that's the opposite of socialization. So that's about how, through the process of education, the uniqueness of each person, each student, is nurtured. How we kind of enrich the lives of individuals, so they kind of realize that they have agency, so they have sort of some sense of control and sense of ability to make change in the world. So they kind of understand themselves better, so they kind of feel the role that education plays in nurturing all of those sorts of things. So in a way, opposite to socialization. Socialization is looking at the big picture of sort of passing on these big cultural and social values, whereas subjectification is much more about the individual and the individual nurturing of talents and skills and ideas of our sort of sense of self. Now Biesta talks about how qualification has become the dominant of those three. In all of the sort of the politics that we've been talking in the press recently, it's all about kind of maintaining the exam system, how we're going to make sure that we kind of pass students fairly and get them onto the next level of education or into work. Qualification becomes this kind of dominant idea of education in contemporary times, and that's really what sort of Biesta, he sets up these three functions, and then he says, but what we're really doing through kind of contemporary schooling, through modern day schooling, is only focusing on qualification, and what we ought to do is look a bit more at the other two and how they're affected by this total focus almost on qualification in this sort of political public discourse about education. So those ideas from Biesta, I think, really relate to this idea that I sort of mentioned earlier on a little bit, that the connection between individuals and society when we think about education is a really important and I think interesting and kind of challenging idea. So this is a kind of a neat quote to get at something which I think is quite exciting when we think about why do we study education, why should we care about education. So education is fundamentally seen as essential for human development for both individuals and societies, and it has the potential to empower, to change lives, to bring about greater opportunity and enrich those who experience it. So in that we can kind of get a sense of some of those functions that Biesta is talking about. But this dual purpose of education for individuals and education for society is, I think, really important to kind of for us to get our heads around what the purpose of education widely is. And I really like this idea, this quote from a guy called Stephen Kemmis and his colleagues. He writes about they write about the proper purpose of education being to prepare people to live well in a world worth living in. And for me, that feels really powerful idea, because we want individuals to feel well prepared to go and live an enriched and exciting life that they feel really satisfied with. But there's no point in preparing people to live that sort of life, to sort of fulfill all of their dreams and aspirations, if the world around them is falling apart. So the proper purpose of education is dual, and they're interconnected. We need to prepare people to live well in a world that's worth living in. So how do we as educators respond to that challenge of providing individuals with the tools and the motivations and the aspirations and the vision to live their life well, whilst also supporting them to create a world that's worth living in for everybody? And I think that's a really key idea of sort of this socially minded perspective on the purpose of education, that does both individuals and social at the same time. And so we like to think that we do that kind of thing on our degree program actually at Warwick, that we we prepare people on our degree really well to go and live their aspirations, to go and do the sorts of things they want to do with their lives. But we instill this kind of sense of social mindedness, that it's about community, it's about the others around you, and the others in society that are really important. So this is just one final slide, just to note the sorts of directions that people go in from when they finished our degree, and you'll kind of see this. It's really a range of really satisfying jobs, really satisfying careers that are connected with making the world a better place, making other people's lives better. And I think that's really key about where people from our degree at Warwick Education Studies go on to do, that focus on satisfying work that's other focused, it's focused on other people, and that's really important. So final slide, just to say thanks very much for watching all the way to the end. I hope that was interesting. I hope you found it useful. I hope you got some insights into what studying education could be about, and maybe your place within it. which would be neat if you could kind of see that some of these ideas resonated with you, and you got a sense of what we do at Warwick and how we approach these things at Warwick. If you want to be in touch, ask any questions, there's the email address, educationundergrad@warwick.ac.uk. So I'm Mark, program leader, and yeah, hope to see you sometime in the future. Thanks a lot.